Melody Salesforce Flowsome.
Hello Flowsome people, welcome to the Salesforce Flowsome channel. In the previous video, we went through how to update multiple records from a collection using a simple loop. And today we're going to go through how to update multiple parent records from a collection of the child object. This is a very important example to go through because essentially we don't have this functionality in Process Builder. So when you switch from Process Builder to Flow, this will be one of the first challenges that might confuse you a bit. If you want to understand Flow more, this will be a sample to study and to be familiar with. So let's just jump right in. But before we start about the flow building, let me explain to you why this case is important. Let's consider the following two cases. The first one is we want to update all the cases. So what we would do is we will use a get record element to get all the cases. And because it will return a collection, we will use a loop to unpack the cases. And in that loop, we will just update the current item. It sounds very straightforward. If you want to update a bunch of records, you first get a bunch of records. And then for each record, you would just update them inside the loop. But then let's consider the next case. What if we want to update the accounts that are associated with each cases? It's the same in the beginning. We will first use a get record to get all the cases. But inside the loop, do we need to use the get record element to get each account that's associated with the current case? The answer is no. So this is the point people might get confused the most. But I have to stress that a variable is not your record. It's a placeholder that copies the value from your record so that you can do some operation inside your flow. They are not the same thing. Again, variable is not a record. So let me just do a quick recap on how variable works. So imagine you have this account A record in your database. When you are in flow, if you want to update this account A, what you need to get is basically two things. The first one is the account ID, and the second one is the fields that you want to update. So here in my flow, I created a variable for account, and I give this variable an account ID and the new value that I want to update. And when I tell the system to update my database using this record, the system will just check if there is any record that's matching the ID. If there is, we will just write the new value into our database. This is why we say a variable is not your record. If you want to update this record in your database, you don't have to get the full copy of that record. Rather, you just need to get the ID and the new values for the fields. Me personally believe this is one of the most important concepts to keep in mind if you're just starting with Flow. So if you're not familiar with variables yet, I would recommend to check out my variable explanation video. So again, in the loop, rather than using another get record element to get each account, because we have the account ID on each case, all we need to do is just to create a variable for account and then assign that variable with the account ID we want to update and the new values that we want to give to this account. When you are building more and more flows, you will bump into this situation a lot. So make sure you are familiar with this example. So today, our learning goal is we want to update the parent records using variables when we are looping through a collection of the child objects. And the business case here is to talk about how to update all the related contacts when some changes are made to an account, given that this organization is using account contact relationship. So why I think this is a good example is because not only that the variable concept might be a bit confusing, the account and contact relationship is something that we don't usually see on the UI. So it would be really nice to learn more or be more familiar with the data model as well. So speaking of data model, let's spend a few moments to go through the data model. So in your org, if you don't have the contact to multiple accounts enabled, your data model will look like this. And on the contact object, you will have that account field. So each contact is only attached to one account. The data model is really straightforward. And for this case, we can just use a simple loop to update all the related contact. But things become a bit complicated if you have the contact to multiple account enabled, because you will have a new object called account contact relationship. It is a junction object that has two master detail relationships, one with account and one with contact, which means that on this object, you will have two parents. That will also mean you will have both account ID and contact ID. And that's an essential information to keep in mind, because when we are building our flow, you have to find out where you can get the ID of the records that you want to update. So that's just a brief introduction, and let's jump into the flow building. So to illustrate the example better, I have an account and I created 4 different relationships. 2 of them are direct, which means that on the contact object, I have to look up to this current account. So that will be a direct relationship. And I have 2 relationships that are indirect, which means that on the contact object, the account is now linked to the current account, but in the related account list, I also added another relationship to the current account. So on this account, I have 4 relationships, 2 are direct and 2 are indirect. And the business case is that when the account is marked as important, I want to update all the contact to important contact as well. And just to note that this field is a field on the contact object. This is not on the account contact relationship object. I just make the name like this so it's less confusing. So again, what we are trying to do is when our account is marked as important, I want to get a list of the account contact relationships. And then through this collection of account contact relationships, I want to update each contact to mark them as important as well. Alright, so let's just jump to our flow builder interface. Since we want to start the flow when the account is marked as important, we will build a record trigger flow. The object will be accounts. And when the record is updated. And since we're updated the other object, we will choose the second one. The condition will be important equals true. And we only want to run the flow when the field is updated to true. So we choose the second option. Then we hit save. The first thing we want to do is to get all the account contact relationship. Or relationships. Accounts, contact relationships. And then there's the account ID equals the account ID has to equal the ID of the record that triggered this flow. So we choose record, the global variable, and then we choose the account ID. We don't have to sort it, but we want to get all the records. So again, we want to get all the relationships where the account ID equals the record ID that triggered this flow. And next, because it's a collection, we will have to use a loop to unpack them. Relationships. And then here it comes to the tricky part. How can we update each contact? So like I mentioned, we do not need to have a get record to get each account again. What we will do instead is we will create a new resource. We will create a new variable. Let's just call that each contact. And it's the type of record, and the object is the contact. Alright, and then we come back to our canvas. So what we need to do is use an assignment to update the variable that we just created. So we want to update each contact. Like I mentioned, if we want to update the record, there are only 2 things that we need. First is the ID. Second one is the fields that we want to update. And we already have the field that we want to update, which will be the important checkbox on the contact object. And this has to be true. But what I would tend to do is I will let it equal the pairing field on the record that triggered the flow. The reason why I want to do this is because for this current business case, it's pretty limited. We only want to update the important field when the account is marked as important. But by doing so, you can make the flow more dynamic, which means that if at any point you mark the important field as false, you can also run this flow until unchecked all the checkbox on the contact level. So I think this is a good habit of writing the assignment. Try not to use the literal value, but dynamic value. Alright, so back to what we say, we already have the fields that we want to update. All that's left is the ID. How can we get the ID for each contact? If you remember, on the account and contact relationship, the contact ID is also stored in the object. So what we need to do is update this variable. And then we say contact ID has to equal the current item, which will be the current account contact relationship, and the contact ID that's stored on the current relationship. So let me explain this again. What we did is we have a blank variable, a placeholder variable, and then we give it the ID value, which is from each relationship record. And then we also give it the field that we want to update. So when you give the system this variable, you're basically telling that, hey, I have this contact whose ID is this one. Can you help me to update that record with this value? So I hope the idea is clear. Alright, and then we're just going to go ahead and then save this assignment. And then again, because we want to store all the records into a collection, we also have to create a collection variable. We can call it updated contacts. It's a type of record, and it's a contact object. And because we want collection, so we have to check allow multiple values. So then we have another assignment, say add to new collection. We enter the collection that we just created, add each contact record or each contact variable that we just created. Right. And then we loop this element back to the loop. So then what this loop is doing is, first I'm unpacking all the relationships, and then for each relationships, I create a new contact variable as a placeholder. And then I get the contact ID from the relationship record, and I also give the new field value. And then I just add it to a collection. And then in the next iteration, my contact placeholder variable will be updated with a new value again. And I added that new value into the collection. So I just keep doing this until I finish iterating all the relationships. So after it's finished, we just have to update all the contacts at once. And then we want to use the variable. And then that is updated contacts. And then save. So that's it. It's also very simple and straightforward. But it's just the concept of the variable is very important in this flow. So we will just go ahead and save this. Alright, and then let's try to debug. I found this changing record sometimes it's not working as expected. So what I would do is I would just skip the start condition, and I will ignore this update the triggering record. But this is a feature that I really like, so I'm looking forward to when it's supporting more functionality. And then we just hit run. And then you will see the flow has run without any errors. So then we will just go ahead and activate this and then test it in our UI. So let me go to my account, and then I will just update important fields and then save. And here you will see all the contact has been updated, regardless of if they are direct contact or indirect contact. That's it of how to update multiple parents using collection and variables. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and turn on notification. Salesforce Flowsome, thank you for watching.